Welcome to another episode of the Payment Strategy Show. I'm Joshua Silver, founder and CEO of Rainforest. Rainforest helps software platforms embed payment processing so they can make money and increase customer retention. I'm here today with VP of Payments, Becky Kopplin. Before Rainforest, Becky led payments at vertical SaaS companies and advised many different SaaS companies as a payment strategy consultant. Welcome to the show, Becky.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So to get started, tell us a little bit about your background. How did you first get into payments?
So I have this theory, and I'm pretty sure it holds up. And if anyone's listening and disagrees, I'm interested to hear. But I don't think anyone gets into payments on purpose. And I also think once you're here, you can't leave. So this is my theory, and I talk to lots of folks to see if I can prove this out. And so far, I'm on track for that. But in the same way, I did not get into payments on purpose. Early 2000s, I started working for a wholesale ISO before I knew what any of those letters meant, and learned payments just kind of from the inside out. And at the ISO, what we did was, a lot of the direct merchant sales. As a wholesale ISO, that meant we also took risk. But what we did uniquely then was kind of payfac before payfac was a thing. And what that meant was we actually consolidated funds and ran those through an FBO. And so card funds, Amex funds, and ACH funds came in, and we provided a consolidated deposit. And that was one of our unique offerings to the market, which is now really kind of basically payment facilitator. But that's what we were doing back in the early 2000s.
Very good. Well, let's do a deep dive on your experience at Ministry Brands, because that, I think, is especially relevant to SaaS leaders who think about getting acquired at some point. So at Ministry Brands, you were on the acquiring side. You were going and buying up other companies. What did you look at when performing due diligence before the acquisition? What factors really drove the valuation or even the decision to acquire them or not?
Sure. And for those not familiar with the Ministry Brands story, basically what we were looking to do was consolidate a very fractured market, which was church technology. And so this covered kind of the gamut of technology to churches and nonprofits. So think website development and presentation software and accounting. But more importantly to this conversation is online giving or giving processing. And so there was a lot of different small providers in the market, and we were looking to consolidate that to really drive innovation for nonprofits in the space. So did an awful lot of acquiring and brought a lot of folks into the Ministry Brands fold, hence the name Brands, right? Referencing all of the different brands that operated under that banner. But from my perspective, overseeing giving and payments, really what we wanted to do was ultimately understood, could we consolidate the back end and really drive economies of scale? And so what we dove into was the payment experience and the payment contract. So what did the merchant, in this case, churches and ministries and nonprofits, what was their experience with the payments interaction? And then what was the giver's experience with the payment interaction? And then what did that vendor stack look like and what the relationship was to all of those parties? And so where this starts to become really important is when you think about kind of the high level merchant or processing models. You've got all the way from a referral model. This referral model, which was really common back in the day for software platforms, was I'm going to take this merchant, I'm going to throw it over the fence at the payment processor, right? They're going to sell it and close it and paper it and give me a mid as the software provider. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the transaction, which kind of throw it over at the fence, and the processor is going to do statementing and support and that's old school referral model. You have kind of integrated model, which is that with a little deeper connections. Maybe you remove some of those exposed steps. And then all the way to today, which is what we see more and more common, which is embedded, which is the payment processor. The provider is entirely behind the scenes. The reason I dive into that is because that matters a ton when I'm going to look at optimizing that payment opportunity, which is really what we were looking at when we were evaluating these software platforms. So what we ideally wanted to see, kind of perfect scenario, was the merchant did not see the payment processor and had no direct relationship with them. The cardholder experience was direct and fully with the merchant, or believed it to be so they weren't aware of any of the vendors. We wanted to see contracts without gotchas. So no exclusivity, no non-solicits, no, incredibly high minimums. And we wanted to see scenarios where platforms owned their data, specifically card data at the time. We didn't even contemplate the idea of owning merchant data back then, which is something we talk a lot about now. But back then that wasn't even on the table, although I would definitely put it on the list now. But effectively, all of these factors would put together kind of a value of it. And the more that was owned, the experience, the contract, the data, kind of the higher value we would place on it. And the less was owned, kind of the opposite would then be true.
So basically, I think to summarize, you were looking for scenarios where you could come in, swap out the underlying payments infrastructure without it being too impactful and disruptive to the merchant. And for the cardholder, they probably wouldn't even know the difference.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And so that I think that's a huge point, when you can do that swap out without it being a big project. Obviously that's going to increase your ability to migrate, right? It's going to increase your adoption rate. To that end, Becky, once a SaaS company was acquired by Ministry Brands, what steps would you take to optimize payments, and what did that process actually look like?
Yeah, we would go down one of two paths, referring back to this other relationship. If we could do a migration, we would do as close to a lift and shift as we could. So we would pick up these merchant accounts and move
Mhm.
them to our preferred provider where we had these kind of economies of scale type of volume-based contract. So we could instantly recognize some cost savings in those scenarios, which again, is part of what drove that higher value. But if they couldn't be moved, right, we would do a different set of things. And really what we're looking for is a handful of indicators in those scenarios. We're looking for ways to optimize interchange. So
Mhm.
for folks that may not know what interchange is what is assessed, essentially determined by the card brands, assessed to the acquiring side, to the merchant, paid to the issuer, kind of the cost of doing business. A lot of categories there, but a lot of opportunities to optimize. So we're looking at good MCC assignment, good data as a part of the transaction. We're looking for timing. Back then, timing was really important, the gap between authorization and settlement. We're looking for a lot
Mhm.
of that. And then what we were also looking for was approval rates. So in that scenario, recurring transactions were a big part of what we did. So keeping those transactions running and those recurring running was kind of top of mind. So diving into approvals and card account update and other opportunities to keep those dollars running. So those are some of the things that we would do to think about optimizing payments.
And as a follow-up to that, what did you find was the most painful of all those different steps? Where did you run into the most challenges typically?
Back then, card account updater was actually really difficult. You'd have to have a
Hmm.
separate provider, and often cases it was very expensive. It was difficult to implement, and as silly as that sounds now, because it comes out of the box in so many places, it was really difficult.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, the MCC assignment was one of the easier ones we do. They were optimized or not, but in some
Sure.
cases, we had processors argue with us about what the appropriate MCC would be, even, and that became kind of an uphill battle. So for each one, it was a little different, but oftentimes card account updater was one of the more challenging ones.
Got it. I think you've probably migrated more mids than almost anybody else in the industry. I think you also have the record for the only person who has ever said that migrations are my favorite. Since most people tend to shy away from them, you really lean in. How do you approach a migration to make it less daunting?
Yeah, I think it's really important to start with the premise that we learned along the way, which is kind of the mantra to say, or the key statement is merchants don't really have brand preference when it comes to processors they work
Mhm.
with. And they may not be thrilled that you're changing a flow, but nobody is like, I absolutely love XYZ processor because they're my favorite. There is a tolerance for that style of vendors, but very rarely is their brand preference. And so, what we found to be true is if you offer somebody a similar product at a similar price, with a similar experience, really folks don't really care. They may not love moving or the act of moving, but I think
Mhm.
people get stuck in their heads that merchants care a lot about where they process, and the fact is they just don't. And so when you start with that premise, you realize what this is now is like move my cheese exercise versus like convincing people that what you're offering them is now better. Parity is now the requirement versus
Hmm.
I need to upsell people to a very exciting thing that's happening because they generally just kind of don't care. And then after that, it's a lot about, there's so many places to go. I think one of the more important things that helps make this easier is segmentation. What also feels very daunting about migrations, especially if you have a lot of them, is you think about in your mind, I'm going to send out an email to, well, thousands and thousands of my merchants, and I'm going to tell them all to fill out this form and move. And you're kind of imagining this wave of calls, right? Or of merchants that are really unhappy about this thing you just did. But the reality is when there's two things that segmentation gives you. One is it gives you the ability to do a test, measure, learn exercise. So start with 10 clients and see how they feel about your messaging and your process. Refine, answer new questions that you didn't think of. Expand that to 50 customers. I've learned now more. I've gotten better at it. I've adopted my messaging. And so what I've done is by the time I send out an email to thousands and thousands, I've really done a good job learning and listening. I think the second thing it lets you do is it lets you customize your message and your process to people based on where they're at. Smallest clients with the least complex integration might get a certain kind of message. My largest clients using my most complex products might get a different experience. And maybe the largest ones are getting a handheld, somebody on site with a phone call, executive presence, right? But now what you've done is you've been very thoughtful about these segments of merchants where they're at. And those two things by themselves kind of remove a lot of the fear around this migration process, which feels very scary to a lot of people.
Yeah, that's interesting. You talk about this test, measure, learn. Outside of the messaging, what are some of the things you've seen over the years that are some of the surprising learnings?
Yeah. So the way you contact them is funny. So a lot of people think email is the only way to go, when in fact, oftentimes a call campaign ends up being wildly
Yeah.
successful. And most people think that that's out of range, but you try it and you realize it's just faster in some cases and easier. That one
Hmm.
was really surprising. We almost always end up with one what we call hand-to-hand combat, the segment of customers. And that's where you've got a CS, you've got an executive, you've got, a lot of folks on there hand holding each one. The fact that you have to do that, I think, was surprising to a lot of folks. But oftentimes it really comes more down to process, in that the process of when do you ask them for their data? When do they provide it? When do you switch over their tokens, right? Like kind of this thing. That's oftentimes what you're learning the most about, is these little moving parts all along the way. I guess one more thing that I wouldn't call test, measure, learn, but we learned a long time ago and other folks still learn the hard way, which is most people approach these as an opt-in, upsell or opt-in, right?
Hmm. Yep.
Hey, pretty please take this really cool payment process if you want to, right? And you put this position of power onto the merchant to go, that's not good enough for me to want to uproot my life. And the reality is, if you start with a posture of, we're upgrading our payment process and it's going to be a really smooth process for you, and complete it by X to avoid disruption of processing or something along those lines, and you treat it like an upgrade, kind of a you're welcome messaging, you end up in a much different place at the end of these migrations.
Yeah, so what does that look like?
I think when you think about that from a you're welcome posture, what you're doing is you're letting them know that you've upgraded their experience and you're presenting them with an opportunity to participate, right, in this upgrade that you've now offered. And so that looks like an invitation to participate now instead of a choice on whether they believe this is better than what they have today. And so that looks a lot like talking about the benefits, but not attempting to sell them on the benefits. This is a better experience for you, and we're upgrading this product. We've heard you. We've heard that you'd like a better experience here, and we've listened to you and we've delivered on that. And it really is a much more of a posture of, we've done exactly what you asked for, and you're welcome. Again, is the language. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily make it in, but this invitation to participate in an upgrade versus a opt-in if you feel like it, which is oftentimes the way a lot of these read.
Yeah, those are some really good tips. If we look at times when things didn't go as well, what are some of the most common obstacles or challenges that come up during the migrations? For times when they were really successful, what do those SaaS companies do to work through them?
I think one of the things that is the most, the kind of the most impactful obstacle or challenge is when the company is not fully committed to the migration. When internal people are kind of everyone's probably going to churn, and so I'm going to go through the motions until I'm proved right, and then I'm going to not participate anymore, because what you don't have is full commitment to this as
Right.
being successful. And I think I referenced, back that in the daunting idea, in that when the whole company's bought into the idea that, right, merchants don't really have a preference, and this is an operational challenge versus I'm going to sell them on a new product. I think that solves a lot of this, but almost all of the challenges that I've run into can oftentimes be come back to your people aren't really fully bought in to the migration internally, like employees.
So it sounds like it's almost a something cultural to overcome and how you're working with your team on it versus some external factor.
I think that's right. And I think the cultural difference between integrated and embedded is one of the more difficult things for folks to overcome,
Mhm.
because they're so similar, but there's such key differences, right? And where you start to feel this is when I'm integrated, I say, hey, merchant, go sign up with XYZ processor. And I reference my external processor. I treat it as a separate decision and a separate module, right? And what folks like about that is they can point at the processor when they don't like things or whatever that is. So it makes them feel a little more comfortable. It actually doesn't make the merchant happy, because what the merchant wants is their problem solved. They don't want it to just not be your problem to solve. And so what you actually find is just happier merchants on an embedded solution. But until you see that and until you're bought into that, that's difficult. But really spending the time to make sure that your internal folks recognize what a better experience this is for merchants holistically. Like, there's no finger pointing, there's one phone call to make, payments are always in context. This is such a better experience. Support calls go down, right? When your folks internally
Right.
recognize what a win 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 this is across the board, then they're in and they find solutions. When they still want to point merchants over to other processors, what they find is problems and challenges. And you see that reflected culturally.
Absolutely. Let's fast forward to your experience as a consultant. You work with a lot of different SaaS companies. What are the biggest mistakes that you typically see SaaS companies make with payments? And what are some of the best practices that they should be following instead?
Yeah. One of the ones that, almost physical reaction to is getting my hands on their contracts and realize they've signed a very terrible contract. And
Yep.
those are a gut punch of you've done yourself a disservice here, right? And that looks a lot of different ways. I'm sure you've seen a lot of these too, right? Like fully exclusive, massive minimums. They don't own their data. They don't own their merchants. There's non-solicits. They don't have their revenue stream. I think are powerless to control their destiny. And anytime any of that's there, that's the thing that I point out the most is the worst thing that you can do in signing a payments contract is give your future away to your processor, which is what you do in all of those scenarios. That there's so many others, but that's the one where it's like it's hard to fix this one, right? Like, it can be done,
Right.
absolutely can be done, and there's a lot of ways to undo that, but control your destiny, own your data. These are your merchants. This is your revenue. If I could billboard that somewhere, I would, but all SaaS leaders shouldn't own their payments data.
Could not agree more. I myself have had to help clean up a lot of really sticky situations where oftentimes it may even be, a CEO or leadership team now that wasn't there when the original payments contract was signed, and it was years ago, and they're just living with the repercussions and ramifications later. So that can certainly
So
be
often.
a pretty tough situation.
Yeah.
Well, as we start to get towards the end of the interview here, you've been in payments a long time. If you could give SaaS leaders just one piece of advice for making their payments offering massive, profitable, successful, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because I think I could probably talk on that for an hour. If I could sum it up, I would say payments needs to be core to your product value and not
Mhm.
an add-on. And I would unpack that a little bit more. I think as long as you're seeing payments as an optional module that people opt into, you've missed an opportunity. And not just on adoption. While oftentimes it's what we're focused on is how do we drive revenue and how do we drive adoption? And I think that's important. But oftentimes the answer is fundamental to that, in that what you really want is a better holistic product. And payments
Right.
does that. It's not just this silo of revenue over here that we can optimize, although obviously you can. But the tighter that integration, like if your product doesn't feel complete until payments are running through it, I think you've hit that. And I think you feel that in a couple of ways. Your salespeople don't have to sell payments separately because the product again feels incomplete, right? I can't get a full end-to-end picture of my customers, my business as a merchant on your system until I can see that end to end. So you see that in sales, you see that in marketing, you see that in adoption, right? You see attach rate go from 30-40%, whatever it is today, to 80-90%, which is where it should be. I think you remove friction points. So it's not a decision to add payments. It's a requirement again to hit on that again. So what
Hmm.
that looks like is
Yeah.
changing the sign up process. I think that product integration and that embedded payment value is what that is. And I've seen people try to figure this out in so many other ways and get it wrong. And so one of the things that people always go to is the way we make payments successful is we drop price, because I'm going to woo
Yeah.
them away from their current processor with price. And I cannot tell you how poorly I've seen this work. So the example I've used in all the times I worked with the platform was convinced this was the case. And they rolled out a 1% processing fee, which, if you're not familiar with payments, is significantly under cost. And they were willing to basically write a check because they thought what that would do is everybody would raise their hand and come rushing over for this 1% processing fee, and nobody bit, because it's not motivating to people to do
Right.
that. And it's not sustainable. So it was obviously a teaser rate on top of that. But you get into sustainable savings, right? You're talking what? I can save you 10, 20 basis points. Like at a portfolio level, that's a huge number. But at a merchant level, that's not interesting, right? What is interesting? Save them time, help them grow their revenue, right? Better reconciliation reporting, save them time with support. Like that's interesting, like the 20 basis points. But so often people are like, price is the answer, price is the answer. And I just have never seen that work. It's product value. So you asked for one piece of advice. I talked for way too long, but to summarize, product value, payments needs to be a core part of your product offering.
Yeah, super, super good wisdom there, making payments part of the core. I mean, today we even see a lot of startups that start a SaaS company specifically for the payments revenue. So they've really taken that to the extreme. They're saying the SaaS is really just a means to an end, if you will, to get that payment volume. So
I love
I
it.
think that message is starting to get out there. Well, that does it for us today, but thank you so much for joining us, Becky. It's been great having you on the show.
Yeah, it's been great being here. Thank you.